presentation, Wild South America with Mark Brazil. For those of you who haven't met him in person yet, he is a world-renowned ornithologist, originally from the UK, also lived in New Zealand for a few years, and now he currently resides in Hokkaido, where he is joining us today, and it is very early in the morning there. So thank you, Mark, for getting up early to present this wonderful show to us. Mark has been around the world plenty of times, been to all 7 continents, doing his own ornithological research, consulting for TV companies, guiding naturalists and photographers as well. He is quite a Renaissance man. These are not the only hats he's worn. He also spent many years working as a professor of biodiversity and conservation at a university near Sapporo. He's also a scientific editor and has written 7 books so far, and I believe is working on another one. He also contributed to a column in the Japan Times newspaper called Wild Watch, and that was going on for 33 years, which is the longest running natural history column in the world to date. So he is also not been bored during this time either. He is currently working on a publication or a publishing project for the Ministry of Tourism and the Ministry of Environment for Hokkaido. So thank you so much for taking a break from all of that important work to speak with us today. Like I said, he's been working with SAGRM since 1998, has led well over probably 60 overland trips now to destinations including like India, Bhutan, Nepal, Colombia, Mongolia, and his favorite, of course, Japan. That snow monkeys and cranes trip is kind of, I think, our longest running trip, maybe besides Botswana. So he has definitely been everywhere and seen everything, and he's going to share some of those things with us today as we go to South America. Without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Mark.
Well, thanks very much, Sonia, and hello everyone. It's great of you to join me. Sonia's told you it's early in the morning here in Hokkaido. It's a bit of a cold, grey, rainy Hokkaido morning. The rainy season is just beginning to hit us. So for me, it's a great time to actually think about going somewhere with a different weather pattern and a little more exciting scenery that I'm seeing out of a limited view out of the window onto a grey sky. Just to give you a little bit of background. Ohayou gozaimasu, Fred. So my first introduction to South America came whilst I was an undergraduate student. In my first year as an undergraduate, I had an incredible chance to go to Guyana. And what was so incredible about that was it was only my first journey outside Western Europe. In fact, only my second journey outside the British Isles. So it was completely mind-blowing. Having grown up in the relatively low biodiversity of temperate England, that Guyanan journey just opened my eyes to the abundance and biodiversity in the neotropics. The plant life, the insect life, the bird life, it was just incredible. And I found the New World amazing, and I was totally hooked. So since the 1980s, I've been making numerous journeys across South America, and I've visited all the countries there with the exception of Uruguay and Bolivia, and I'm itching to explore Bolivia. And just today, I want to think about a journey that starts, actually I've stolen a little bit of another continent. I know I'm talking about South America, but I've actually stolen a little bit of Antarctica, and we're going to start our journey in the far south and carry on up all the way through the continent. I've been very fortunate, and I've been making journeys to the Antarctic Peninsula since the 1990s. Most notably this year in January on our SAGRM AFSG trip, which was just phenomenal. I do hope one day that I can travel south from New Zealand to the other side of Antarctica. But if you haven't already been to Antarctica at least once, make sure you put it on the top of your destination bucket list. You can't fail to have a fabulous time. As you've heard from Sonia, I've been leading land trips in South America almost annually now since 2007, and especially to Brazil, and more recently also to Colombia. And I can strongly recommend both countries to you. And I've also had the pleasure of traveling on board the Zafiro, very nice hotel boat in the Peruvian Amazon. And I'll show you some images from each of these destinations. So today I want to take you on an easy armchair journey through an amazing region of our world, starting in Antarctica and ending in the Andes, and taking in the region's wildlife from penguins to hummingbirds. Well, starting down in Antarctica, the landscapes, the seascapes and icescapes, as so many of you already know, they're just totally mesmerizing and breathtaking. There's so much to see, and it's so hard to take it all in. And of course, because most voyages south are during the height of the southern summer, the daylight stretches on and leaves very little time for sleep. Well, it's one thing to be ship cruising near a massive fragment of an ice sheet, but there are few experiences more thrilling than cruising by zodiac amongst smaller ice. And seeing wind and water-carved shapes in the ice is like watching for imaginary creatures in the clouds, except that at any moment a real seal, a whale or a penguin may appear, and the entertainment factor is just phenomenal. Because the biodiversity of Antarctica is extremely limited, but its biomass is phenomenal. And our close encounters, whether they're with whales, with orca or humpback or leopard seals, these provide the periods of excitement alongside enormous and powerful creatures to match the time that we spend at penguin colonies. Here you can see Adelie penguins at their colony feeding the chicks, and you can just see the way that colony extends all the way up the hillside. Phenomenal number of birds. And I've always called myself a bird watcher. I'm not a bird lister. I like to watch the behavior of things, learn what they're doing. And as we sit beside a penguin colony, watching their behavior, we find just endless fascinating facets of their life histories, whether they're courting, whether they're incubating eggs or rearing chicks, or stealing stones from a neighbor's nest. But of course, whilst we watch the penguins, the skuas and the snowy sheathbills are watching them too. And the skuas reveal their bullying predatory tactics, whereas the sheathbills perform their no-nonsense garbage disposal duties. And you can see a sheathbill on the left of the screen there, tackling an abandoned penguin egg. They'll literally clear up anything around the colony, whether it's dead chicks or dead adults or remnants or meals or eggs. They're the species that are going to tidy everything up around the colony. But of course, we all have to have a favorite wildlife watching destination, and that might be quite hard to pick for many of us. But for me, it's absolutely most definitely South Georgia. This island is one that I would be happy to go back to year after year after year. It's just so phenomenal. And what a penguin paradise. I never tire of the sight of the king penguin colonies. These enormous breeding colonies are spectacular to watch. But actually, for me, it's the sound of hundreds of thousands of individuals of king penguins crooning that's most wonderful. Of course, there are other species here too. The wandering albatross is here, that phenomenal seabird, the giant of the seabird family with a wingspan of up to 11 feet and 3.5 meters in the largest individuals. And this shares the skies with perhaps the most consummate of all the flyers. They're like the Olympic synchronized flyers, the light-mantled sooty albatrosses, which do those wonderful paired display flights over the islands. And I couldn't resist putting in a picture of one of the down south teams, because it's the team members, colleagues and friends that go down south that help make these trips so phenomenal too. And you recognize familiar faces there: Dan Olsen, Kelsey in the middle, Rich Pajan bottom right, and Tom bottom left. But of course there are others, they're not in the picture: Jim Wilson and Madalena Patacho, and then TH sitting in the middle. The teams down south are absolutely phenomenal and make for such a wonderful trip and wonderful experiences. But if we move on from Antarctica and South Georgia, we can't miss out a visit to the Falkland Islands. And I have an especially soft spot for these islands because back in the mid-1990s, I spent several weeks here traveling around many of the islands, and I think to all of the inhabited islands, on behalf of Japanese broadcasting. And that was to make some programs about the islands, but most specifically about the rockhopper penguins. So I spent time there in a way that I haven't managed since, and it was just a fantastic introduction to the islands. Here you can see Steeple Jason, an island we visited on our January visit this year. And of course, going to the Falkland Islands, we invariably go into Stanley. And that provides a little touch of England in the Southern Hemisphere, but in a uniquely Falkland Island way. For those of you who've been already to the Falklands, you'll know that the landscapes here are raw, they're open, big skies, and truly inspiring. Of course, wildlife abounds here too, and it's the focus of a local tourism industry, as well as an attraction for international companies such as ours. And the islands are incredibly rewarding, whether you're interested in geology. There are those fantastic stone runs that I hope you can see in the middle at the bottom of the screen. Of course, there's wonderful wildlife to watch as well. As I say, the landscapes are raw and open, but the wildlife, the masses of wildlife, very approachable, wonderful to spend time up close at colonies, whether they're of Gentoo penguins, Magellanic penguins, those are the ones in the burrows at the bottom right. Rockhopper penguins, of course, the punks of the penguin world with that wonderful wispy crest. And then the black-browed albatrosses. These make a fantastic quartet of characters to watch against a really windswept landscape that's endlessly shifting with the changing weather. As they say in the Falklands, if you don't like the weather, just wait 5 minutes and something different will come along. But if we jump west from the Falkland Islands, head to the southern tip of the continent, we reach that region known as Patagonia. The area that spreads over parts of Chile and parts of Argentina, the southernmost region of South America. And this is a worthy destination in itself, but it's often visited as an extension to an Antarctic or a Chilean fjord voyage. But for many of us, it's a gateway. Patagonia, the Beagle Channel, this is the starting and ending point for so many voyages south. And that perhaps makes it the most memorable part of South America for some visitors who don't see anywhere else in the continent. They fly in perhaps to Ushuaia, board a ship, head down the Beagle Channel and off to the southern oceans. Well, the Beagle Channel can be blustery, can be brooding or benign, but it's certainly never boring. You never know what's going to be coming up that channel. And in fact, on the last day of our voyage there in January, we had the stunning sight of a gannet or a booby flying up the Beagle Channel, which was, whichever species it was way out of range. Well, the mountains of the south are spectacular, and on my bucket list of places to visit is Torres Del Paine. My friends and colleagues, Tom Sharp and Rich Pagan, rave about the region, and I hope to get there one day, because while I've spent plenty of time with tigers in India and jaguars in Brazil, I hope one day to spend time with the pumas of Patagonia. It's perhaps the best place in the world to watch these animals. And on your screen at the moment, at the right, you should have a wonderful guanaco. That's a photo from Rich Pagan. And then in the center, you have the phenomenal Magellanic woodpecker, one of the largest woodpeckers in the world, which occurs down in that southern region of South America. But moving on now, moving up the continent, heading into Brazil, one of the must-see destinations is the incredible Iguazu Waterfall. This is the world's largest waterfall system and situated on the Brazilian and Argentinian border. And the picture that you see here is taken in a year when the rains had been heavy, when the falls were full or nearly full. I've seen these falls when all of the cataracts have joined up, because there's so much water coming over the falls. And a local friend and guide who works there shared some pictures with me of a time when the rains had failed. And if you can imagine that entire scene without any water at all, except one tiny plume, one tiny trickle of water coming over. That's how variable Iguazu Falls can be, from an extreme dry season to an extreme wet season. Well, the falls are set in the oldest and richest rainforest in the New World. This is the Atlantic rainforest. And this rainforest predates the rising of the Andes 45 million years ago. And although it's now in tiny fragments, it still supports many fabulous creatures, such as the marmoset you can see on the left there, and the tamarins. But that species in the middle, the great dusky swift, is perhaps one of the oddest of the birds that you might see in South America, because this one nests right behind the waterfall. So as you stand and watch the falls, you suddenly see screaming parties of these birds dashing around in the spray, and then they'll suddenly fly right through the waterfall and disappear behind the water. So they're nesting behind the waterfall, out of sight mostly. That was a glimpse I got, that picture, from the side of the waterfall, where I could just see round the back of the cataract. Well, that Atlantic rainforest, as I said, is in patches. It's up the east coast of South America, up the Brazilian coast. And we visit a number of different patches of forest on our different itineraries in Brazil. And our trips to Brazil are all about superlatives, the biggest and the most exciting species. We see a lot of different species, but we are looking for some really, really large ones. And this one particularly is the largest primate in the Americas. It's the muriqui, or the woolly spider monkey, and it's restricted to the Atlantic rainforest. They're up to 80 centimeters in length and weigh up to 15 kilograms, but it's the long prehensile tail that gives this animal and its long limbs give it an elegant, rangy look. And this is one of Brazil's, what I call the Big 10, and I'll tell you more about the others later. But I've mentioned that, you know, the birds of this part of the world are quite fantastic. And of course, we do have bird watchers join us on our trips. And in the lower left, you might see Jenny Cloudman watching a puffbird, and her husband is along and taught me the new meaning of SOB. SOB stands for Spouse of Birder. And the spouse of birders' job is to not only test out the ice cream, but also in Terry's case, to make sure that great photographs are taken as reminders of the trip. Another location in the Atlantic rainforest is the wonderful sanctuary at Kurata. This is a very peaceful place, an old seminary, and we've spent many evenings here waiting and watching for the largest canid in South America. This is the maned wolf, and it comes out to food put out specially for it. We sometimes encounter them elsewhere, but this, the location at the seminary, is the most reliable site to watch them in the world. It's definitely another of the Big Ten. It's like a very rangy, long-legged fox, a wolf-sized fox on long legs, a wonderful animal to watch for. Well, Minas Gerais state, which is where we spend a lot of time on a number of our itineraries, it's not all about Atlantic rainforest. In the center of the state, there's this area of raised grassland. It's a high plateau at Canastra. It has wonderful scenery and a plethora of special plants that grow in this arid environment. And that very tall plant that you can see near the top left, it looks like one of those fiber optic lamps. It's got long, spindly tips, and they really look as if they should light up at night. And then the tree in the bottom left is the ipe, and they just light up in beautiful yellow foliage. And this tree is synonymous with springtime in many parts of Brazil. If you like, it's the kind of cherry blossom of this part of South America. Absolutely gorgeous trees. But we come to this area, the grasslands of Canastra. We're looking for another one of the largest species, and that's the giant anteater. They're quite a challenge to search for. Endless rolling landscape. You can see that I get up on top of termite hills to look for them, scanning and scanning across the grasslands, eventually hoping to encounter a giant anteater. They snuffle along like a huge vacuum cleaner, and their eyesight isn't so great, but they are very sensitive to vibration. So if we're fortunate, if we can pull up close to one and then approach very gingerly on foot, making sure that our footfall is very gentle so there's not much vibration, we can sometimes get really close to these animals and get that wonderful experience of hearing them snuffling along as they're searching for ants and termites. We sometimes get to see them elsewhere in Brazil, and sometimes their smaller cousin, the southern tamandua, pops out during our visits to the Pantanal. But it's here in Canastra that we can search for the giant anteater in its very best habitat. Well, for wildlifers, when we talk about Brazil, invariably two major habitats come to mind. The first is the tropical rainforest, and the second is the Pantanal. So I want to show you some images of both of these. This forest is an ancient one. It dates back some 40 million years to a time after the Andes range had formed and was being uplifted. And when that happened, that forced the main river of the region to reverse its flow and to exit eastwards into the Atlantic rather than west into the Pacific, changed the entire ecology of this heart of the continent. But over those 40 million years, the diversity of that forest has evolved in phenomenal ways. I couldn't help but put in a picture of a Brazil tree, Brazil nut tree, nuts there in the middle, but also just some of the tree forms. The great buttress roots of these tropical forest trees are amazing. You can see my friend and colleague Frederico Tavares in the bottom image there, standing next to the roots of one of these mega forest trees. And on the right, I hope you can see the tree with a watermark partway up the trunk. This is evidence of the seasonality of this kind of riverine rainforest, the várzea in parts of Brazil. And you can see that that's just how far the water flowed up the trees above ground level, but very often the water level in the rivers when we're there in the dry season, you've got another 2 meters of exposed riverbank below that. So a phenomenal range of water levels, fantastic diversity of wildlife, makes for a wonderful experience visiting the tropical heart of Brazil.
Mark, could you just go back for a second?
How far back, Fred?
Can't go back, huh?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, the Brazil nuts in the middle,
Yes.
are in the middle of that husk, the Brazil nuts are loose like that?
Yeah, that's a fully dried out seed pod. So they start off in a matrix and then that dries out and the nuts are left in this dry round pod, which is so hard you need to saw it open.
The outer husk looks like about the size of a coconut.
It is, that's right, yeah. So I'm just going to press on, Fred, and then maybe we can chat about other things at the end. So I wanted to show you some of the other things that we're looking for when we're in the tropical forest. It's a difficult habitat to seek out specifics, but wherever we go, we bump into amazing things. So whether it's just enormous trees, gatherings of butterflies, or in this wonderful white-chinned jacama, or that enormous moth in the middle, there's always a surprise coming along. And that moth, by the way, that's got various English names, the great white witch or the great gray witch. That's the biggest moth in the Americas and the 3rd biggest moth in the world. So we visit various itineraries, some truly remote locations, places that perhaps some of you know the names, the Mamiroa Sustainable Reserve, the Cristalino Lodge, and even the River of Doubt, otherwise known as Rio Roosevelt, perhaps the most remote place that I've been to on Earth. Although the tropical forest is rich in biodiversity, it really gives up its secrets very slowly. So it takes patience to seek out even the common species. And we spend a lot of time either on the water or at the waterside, just waiting and hoping for things to happen and waiting for each of the day's big surprises. That might be a set of rapids, as on the Rio Roosevelt. It might be a pied lapwing foraging at the water's edge, or perhaps a centurion tree frog or an orange-cheeked parrot in the forest. And very occasionally, we find what looks like a huge truck tire coiled up at the waterside, and that is a green anaconda. Well, we're always on the lookout for a range of monkeys and sloths and river dolphins. We stumble on amazing insects like that stick insect in the lower center hanging out with a stick. And even our local our guide, Frederico Tavares, sometimes sees life birds. Here he is, very excited because on this particular trip, we just found our first collared puffbird together. And as I said, each day brings unexpected sightings, unexpected experiences. with this fantastic biodiversity in the tropical forest. But my favorite of all Brazilian habitats, and in fact my favorite South American wildlife destination, is definitely the enormous Pantanal. It's so large, it's hard to grasp the scale. It spans 3 countries. It covers 170,000 square kilometers, or 66,000 square miles, and supports amazing iconic wildlife, such as this huge Jaguar stork. This is the tallest flying bird in the Americas, and it's the 3rd largest in terms of wingspan after the Californian and Andean condors. Well, there's so much to see on a trip here that even 2 weeks just scratches the surface, and I'd happily stay a month at each visit. This scene is from the top of a tower near one of the lodges that we stay as we travel down through the northern Pantanal. And it's a base where we look for many of the Pantanal species. And whether they're mammals or birds, many of them are large and photogenic and belong to that Brazil's Big Ten, making the Pantanal an almost perfect wildlife watching destination. You see giant otters there, you've got capybaras and caiman, and a very common way for us to get around in the Pantanal is on the river system using small boats. Well, nothing can compare with those wonderful safari lodges that we get to stay at in southern Africa. But the accommodations in the Pantanal are very pleasant, and they're always friendly, even if most of their charm comes from being rustic. But most importantly, they're situated right where we want to be, which is close to where we can find the wildlife. Such as here, you've got an image or two of the Hyacinth Macaw. This is the largest of the world's parrot family. It measures 1 meter in length, weighs up to 1.7 kilograms, and it has a bill as powerful as a pair of bolt cutters. They can bite into palm nuts that when you try and scratch them with your nail, you don't leave a mark. And you would need not a knife, but a saw to get into them. And these birds just crack them with their bills. So an amazing species, and one that's being recovered from near extinction thanks to the protection and the efforts being made by the lodges in the Pantanal area. Well, it's renowned as the largest wetland in the world, but we time our visits towards the end of the rainy season in September or October, because at that time of year, that's when there's minimum water, and that's when the wildlife is more likely to be concentrated at the waterside. So that's when we can be looking out for things like the tapir. Caimans are there all the time, but we have fantastic views during that drier part of the year. And sometimes we're really lucky and an agami heron may come out into view for us to photograph. So we make excursions by boat onto the rivers. We seek out some of the key animals, and we do that by using a wildlife viewing truck. This is quite a big truck, quite high, so that we can see out over the vegetation. And we go out during day and night to watch for the more elusive creatures, such as the crab-eating fox and the crab-eating raccoon. And sometimes we bump into an anteater or even an ocelot at night. But the icing on the cake for any day spent on the river is a sighting of a jaguar. And this is the largest cat in the Americas, and it's the 3rd largest cat in the world after the tiger and the lion. They can measure up to 2.5 meters in length, that's over 8 feet, and weigh up to 148 kilograms or 300 odd pounds. And if you're familiar with leopards in Africa and think they're large, well, try and imagine a leopard that hangs out in the gym, bulks up on steroids and exercises all day, because these animals are immensely muscular. They exude power. And they're so strong, their bite is so strong that when they're hunting, which typically they might be hunting caiman or capybara at the waterside, they kill them by pouncing and biting them to the back of the head. With one bite, they can kill a large animal. Very occasionally, we're lucky to find them at repose on the side of the river, and then we can spend time with them. We watch whilst they relax, and occasionally we get treated to these wonderful opportunities to photograph them. Well, it wasn't until I went to the southern Pantanal that I realized there was a whole new approach to this region that I hadn't been aware of. Now, imagine that some of you have been drift snorkeling. I'd been drift snorkeling in the Galapagos and off Western Australia, but I'd never heard of drift snorkeling in fresh water until I visited this Rio Sucuri, which is near Bonito in the southern Pantanal. It's an amazing experience because you're in tropical heat, you put on a wetsuit, and then you hike through a forest, getting hotter and hotter, and eventually you arrive at a beautifully clear spring, and then you get into cool, clear water and drift downriver with the current, watching for fish as you go, and listening, because this river goes through forests. So whilst you're snorkeling and looking for fish, you can listen for howler monkeys and birds in the forest above you. Absolutely awesome. Not far away is a phenomenal geological feature. This is the sinkhole known as Buraco dos Araros, the Mcore Sinkhole. And this is where there's a tremendous roost of red and green macaws. They come in the late afternoon and add a touch of color and noise to this spectacular feature. Well, I mentioned that Brazil's Big Ten because many of our clients are travelers who go to Africa very frequently, and they're always talking about the Big Five. So we started listing them up in Brazil and realized that, well, if you think of the biggest land mammal, the tapir, the biggest cat in the Americas, the jaguar, the largest anteater, the giant anteater, the maned wolf, the biggest canid in the Americas, in South America, sorry, the muraki, the largest primate in the Americas, the giant otter, the biggest otter in the world, the biggest member of the weasel family. You've also got the black caiman, the jabiru stork, the greater rhea, the largest flightless bird of the Americas, that Hyacinth Macaw I showed you, the largest of the parrot family, and then you've got the world's biggest butterfly and the largest moth in the New World. So in fact, more than the Big Ten, we end up with the Big 12 in Brazil, and there are really some phenomenal species to watch for on our wildlife trips. But Brazil isn't all of South America, so moving on, let's think a little bit to the west, and Peru, of course, is not just wildlife. There are fantastic archaeological sites making it well worth visiting. But my most recent visit was to the Pacaya Samiria Reserve in the Peruvian Amazon. And there I was aboard the Zafiro, a very pleasant hotel liveaboard boat, and a great comfortable home base while exploring ashore on foot or out on the rivers in smaller boats. Great jungle experiences here. It's a relaxing trip with jungle experiences day and night, dolphins to look for in the rivers, and bird life and animal life in the forests. And for me, the Hyacinth is the standout bird of this region, with its punk hairstyle and its bizarre floppy flight. and its renowned flatulence. This is a vegetarian, and it's reputedly the smelliest of all the birds in the world. I can't claim to have a strong enough sense of smell to support that, but that's its record-breaking quality. And if you're not into the birds, well, then there are the primates to look for, and also the spiders. Fantastic area for looking for tarantulas. And I was even fortunate to bump into a bird-eating spider, the largest spider in the world. Well, birds, mammals, and reptiles are most definitely a focus on our wildlife itineraries, but we also take in local cuisine and local beverages, and where it's practical, we also drop by not to be missed historical or archaeological sites. Well, the modern cultures of South American countries are heavily derived from their sort of Iberian imperial colonial past, but the indigenous peoples are still there. Their cultures do survive, as do relics of their past cultures. And so when we head to Colombia, we head to Bogota, and we can't miss the spectacular Gold Museum to see some of these phenomenal items that have been collected there. It's an excellent display of pieces of artwork that are just incredible in their detail. And a visit to the historical quarter and the museum just make a wonderful start to a journey in that country. But Colombia also offers the greatest avian show on earth. It supports more than 2,000 species, which is more than a fifth of all the birds in the world. And whilst we're not a bird tour company, birds are wildlife too, and they become the fascinating focus for and backdrop to our journeys in Colombia. And after all, who can resist spectacular hummingbirds with names like Woodstar and Thornbill, Coquette and Sunbeam, Trainbearer and Metaltail, just to name a few. They come in mind-blowing colors and extraordinary plumage features, or in the case of the one on the left there, the sword-billed hummingbird, the longest bill in proportion to its body of any bird in the world. These are high-speed creatures just appearing and disappearing right before our eyes, just irresistible to watch. Also irresistible whilst we're in Colombia is a cup of coffee. And whilst we're passing through the coffee region on our way to the high mountains, we stop off to learn from master growers and roasters and distributors so that we can understand how the Colombian coffee story unfolded and where Colombian coffee heads to around the world. So a cup of coffee takes us on our way to the high mountains into the Andes. Well, this habitat, the Colombian Paramo, in a way, it's a little bit like that high grassland that I showed you in Minas Gerais, but even at a higher elevation, a very arid environment. And this one has got a rich flora, a fantastic area to explore. I'm not sure how well you know the Andes. We're mostly familiar with that single spinal ridge to South America, but up in Colombia, the Andes break into a fan of 3 separate ranges, and each flank of those ranges has its own endemic species, unique plants, insects, amphibians, and birds. So a wonderful display of biodiversity and endemism. And Colombia, with its different coastlines, its llanos, its grasslands, its wetlands, deserts, and tropical forest, it's not surprising that it has more bird species than any other country on Earth. If you see the fellow There with the tray, that's Alejandro, another of our local guides in South America, and he's actually coming up with a tray of coca tea, a local herb tea, which is wonderful for fighting off the effects of altitude, because here in the Paramo, we're headed up to 4,000 meters, around 12,000 feet. So that's the highest elevation we reach in the trip. As I mentioned, fantastic arid upland vegetation, adapted to the cold, the intensity of the sunlight, and there's even a local hummingbird here, the buffy helmet crest, which is also adapted to the low temperatures. It's not hovering, it's not dashing about, it spends its time feeding at flowers and then sitting, saving energy in the cold, low temperatures. Well, we also visit Jardín and Medellín, and in Jardín we spend some time relaxing at a street cafe, enjoying the ambience of this lovely historical town. And in Medellín we check out the street art, such as the statuary by Fernando Botero. And in the image with three guys, you can see in black, you can see Diego Calderon, our local leader and local guide in Colombia, another great guy to travel with and a fantastic naturalist. Brings tremendous sense of fun to our Colombian trips, just as Federico Tavares does to our time in Brazil. Well, once we've enjoyed a nice relaxing drink in the plaza in Jardín, we walk just a few blocks to an amazing sanctuary right on the edge of town overlooking the river. And our aim here is to visit a lek, and that's the communal display ground of this extraordinary day-glow red Andean cock of the rock. This is a large bird. It's, putting it in North American terms, it would certainly be perhaps twice the size of an American robin. So we're looking at a big, showy bird, very noisy, displaying communally, attracting the females to the lek for their courtship. Also close to Medellín is an amazing orchid collection. And here naturalists are generally not only overwhelmed by the botanical diversity, but also by the resemblance of the orchids to monkeys. These are in fact monkey orchids. And the one on the left has got about the best scientific name of any plant you could imagine. It's called Dracula vampira. The one on the right is Dracula simia. So these are the monkey orchids. Lots of orchids in South America, and we see plenty during our trips in Brazil and in Colombia. But this is a site where orchids are grown for display and makes for a wonderful visit. Well, as we head further north, we're almost at the northern tip of the continent now. And well beyond the fragmented fan of the northern Andes is a completely isolated mountain range called the Santa Marta Mountains. It's close to the Caribbean coast, and it's been separated so long from all the other mountain ranges in South America that it's become a fantastic center of endemism with plants, with insects, amphibians, and birds that occur on these mountains and nowhere else in the world. And at night, we go out and we're looking for wildlife. It might be frogs, might be roosting birds, or in this case, we found a night monkey in a fruiting tree just near our lodge. Always lots to look for. And of course, as with many of the places we visit in Colombia, there are fantastic hummingbird feeders. When we ran the video as a test, it was a little bit jerky. I'm hoping that you're seeing it as more than just isolated frames. But we've got three species of hummingbirds here, three species known as violet ears, the brown violet ear, lesser and sparkling violet ear, and then the white-bellied ones, those are the white-vented plumelet ears. But you can just see the buzzing life around the feeders. And that's just a little insight into how busy our time is when we're in the Santa Marta Mountains. Well, our Colombian expedition, we say our farewells in the historical northern port of Cartagena on the humid Caribbean coast. And this is a city that was founded by Spanish colonists in the 16th century, but it had been settled by indigenous peoples at least 5,000 years earlier. Today, it has a World Heritage Site, the Walled City and the Fortress, and we spend a little time at these sites and in the delightful cobbled streets with their colonial era architecture. It's a wonderful town to just wander around, drop into a cafe, have a meal in a local restaurant. And for us on that trip, it's also where we end the trip, and we will have our final sunset cocktails at a place not to be missed, a beach cafe with live music overlooking the sea. What a fantastic place to round out a trip, but not rounding out the talk, because I want, just in the last couple of minutes, to take you to that other great wildlife location in South America, or in fact, off South America, and I'm thinking of the Galapagos. Nearly 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador. Again, it's one of those destinations that repays multiple visits, and if you haven't been, definitely put it on your bucket list. And the special thing I feel about the Galapagos is that it's one of the best destinations in the world for families. It's a tremendous place for a 3-generation holiday, because sharing this location as a family just brings it so much to life. Of course, children see things so differently anyway, whether it's the underwater world or the above water world. It makes for a tremendous visit. Well, the islands support, in a way, the most famous biodiversity on Earth, thanks to the writings of Charles Darwin and then to dozens of documentaries on television ever since. So, of course, it was high on my list of places to go. But the first time I went there, I was a non-snorkeler. I wasn't even much of a swimmer. But I reveled in the above water landscapes and the amazing endemic reptiles and birds, and thought, what an incredible place. But when I returned a year later as a converted snorkeler, I discovered that it was the underwater world that was even more absorbing. And it's hard to beat being in the water with sea lions, penguins, and marine iguanas, not to mention all of the fish life. An absolutely fabulous location. And as I said, a wonderful place to share with children. Well, this has been a bit of a wild romp through South America, but I hope it might have inspired you to join me or one of our other expedition leaders on a fantastic South American wildlife adventure one day in the future. In the meantime, I hope you'll all stay safe, keep healthy, and while you can't travel physically, I hope you can enjoy further mind travel journeys with Zagram Expeditions through our series of armchair explorations. Thanks very much.